Very nice to see you all. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very happy and honoured to be visiting as the Forums Professor this year. And I think it's very important, not only because it's a beautiful sunny day and it's a beautiful campus and it's great to be here, but it's very important for me to be doing this lecture in Cologne for reasons which I hope will become clear. But before I start, I want to dedicate the lectures I'm giving to Christophe Deloire for the saddest of reasons, that he died very, very suddenly just over a week ago, and he's somebody I had the privilege of working with quite closely on his project, the Forum for Information and Democracy. Christophe Deloire was the director of the NGO Reporters Without Borders, and part of Reporters Without Borders is part of an international group of non-governmental organizations dedicated to supporting media freedom. So dedicated to supporting a particular idea of how democratic states are legitimized by public opinion. So we assume that we all have the freedom to access the ideas we need to inform our political decisions, and that depends on a particular idea of media freedom. So it's very sad that he died at the age of 53 after a very short illness, and I just wanted to dedicate the lectures to him because I think this is very important work, and I think the theoretical work that I do is very much part of a practical project to think about the ideas that are behind the laws, regulations, and policies that we implement in the media sector. So this is, the lecture is going to be partly about my last book, Media Freedom, but it's also about the next book, which involves today looking into the past of the regulatory frameworks that are so familiar to us as regards broadcasting and the press, but also into the future. We're currently undergoing a technological revolution, and with that comes a very rapid reassessment of the regulatory frameworks for all of communication and information. And for me, that process of change is all about those deeper theoretical understandings which are interdisciplinary and which we need to unpack in order to inform law and regulation in the present. So if that sounds incredibly ambitious, it's because I think the lectures themselves are really ridiculously ambitious. I'm trying to think about interdisciplinary questions as regards the media. So I understand there are people here from economics, from media economics, and also from media studies, which is also appropriate. And I've been thinking a lot about the links between media economics and the way we understand the political economy of the media and the way media studies traditionally has approached the political economy of the media. So what I'm going to do for you today in this first of the two lectures is set out, in this first section, I'm going to give you some heavyweight theory, I'm afraid. There's going to be lots of quite crunchy theory. But then we're going to go into the past. We're going to talk about where the frameworks for media regulation come from. And in particular, I want to look at Japan, the United States, the United Kingdom, and also Germany, before we then return in the conclusions to thinking about theoretically how we need to update our theoretical frameworks in order to have new ways of thinking about how we regulate the media in Europe, but also in the wider world. So, are you ready? Okay, you look really worried. You should be. We're not an enormous group, so if you have any questions or any clarifications, do just raise your hand, and we can have a discussion. So we will have time for discussion at the end as well, hopefully. So, first of all, the theory. I thought the best way of actually explaining my peculiar approach to theory is a little bit biographical, in that I'm somebody, as an academic, who's moved around a lot. I started in sociology. I also worked in political science and also political theory. But then for some reason I don't understand, I got a job in law at the University of Oxford, looking at media law, and now I'm at the London School of Economics. And all the way along that journey, I've been concerned with how these different fields look at things in different ways and come to the same issues with different sets of assumptions. And in a sense, when I then became a political advisor, so a media policy advisor working quite closely with the Blair government in the United Kingdom, and I looked to the academy, trying to advise on, this was the 2003 Communications Act, I looked to the academy to see maybe there's some guidance in terms of principles for how we should approach broadcasting and the press in the Communications Act. And I found that actually there's very little agreement or coherence across different disciplines. And one of the reasons I think that policymakers get so caught up in lobbying by powerful media interests is because what is coming from the academy is so fragmented and so theoretically undeveloped. So part of what I'm doing in this next project is posing the question across law, particularly public law and constitutional law, media studies, media economics, are there common frameworks and common principles? I was always struck by the lack of dialogue between media theory and media law. For example, understandings that I discussed in my last book about whether media freedom is a normative value or actually a justiciable legal standard in any sense, for example. So as I approach these things, this is to give you a kind of an orientation of my, my political kind of approach. I thought, for example, about how media economics has a lot of agreement about how media systems work. And there are experts in the room who would do this better than I can, but media have particular economic characteristics. So, for example, and I'll just give you the shorthand here, the media economists will be familiar, things like, obviously, high barriers to entry, the fact that media have high fixed costs and low marginal costs, public goods features to media markets, and things like network effects. All of these things give media a particular political economy, and we can generalize, if you like, about the processes in media markets of media concentration. So media markets being very prone to concentration, which is why you have the emergence of very powerful mass media, why those mass media tend to require high levels of investment. There are high barriers to entry, and therefore, in a sense, there are links to the way media studies, particularly post-Marxist, if you like, media studies, sees these as capitalist media, as likely to reflect the interests of capital because of those economic processes, because of that political economy. So that, in media studies, you have that as a background to the critique of the media. So we criticize the media for reinforcing systems and structures of domination and power. because we can understand them as capitalist media, high barriers to entry, often loss-making, often the playthings of billionaires. However, empirically when we study the media, and this was always my problem, I think, as I got to know more about media studies, there are also things like the profession of journalism, the idea of the watchdog role of the press. And these ideas are often written into the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. These principles of professional ethics, which are written into journalistic codes, they would seem to suggest that the media are not just the playthings of capitalists. How many people here have done some journalism? Okay. Did you have any kind of code of ethics in your journalism training? Okay, well, but you've done some journalism, maybe you've done some student journalism. When I talk to journalists, I invariably find out that intellectually, they kind of understand the political economy critique of the media and the idea of capitalist media, but they also have a sense of the professional values that are in tension with it. So in my, if you like, my theoretical understanding of this tension also comes from studying journalism in law and policy, and studying journalistic codes of ethics, and understanding that journalists themselves have some kind of autonomy from those mass media organizations, and they're very often in tension with it. So we can't simply say that the media are reinforcing domination, the tool of capitalism, and we need to think about checks and balances on media power. And that brings me to institutionalism. In most of the social sciences, you have had oppositions between kind of structure and agency, micro and macro, concerns about the relationship between political economy and individual behavior and outcomes. And institutionalism in economics, in political science, is how most academics, in my experience, say they reconcile these theoretical questions. So institutionalism says, okay, you have these big structures, you have these big media, you have these political economy effects, but you also have institutions which actually affect outcomes, so that structure is not determining outcomes, and neither is this just a matter of individual agency and rational choice. So I describe my approach as an institutionalist approach, and in particular, socio-legal institutionalism. I'm thinking about how the media, in particular, are socially and legally constructed. And we can think about that in terms of the platforms, and I'll be in my lecture tomorrow, I'll be speaking about how platform regulation has led to, and in particular, the liability arrangements has led to what we have now in terms of platform dominance. But you can say the same thing in terms of the mass media. They're in part, the mass media that we have are in part not just about political economy, but about institution building. People understanding that there are outcomes in terms of the media that should be avoided, and regulation needs to address that. And I'm going to speak about that today. So why we got to this theoretical outcome is what I'll just spend a little bit of time recapping before I talk about the stories and the countries that I want to talk about. And in the longer paper that accompanies this, I talk about this in terms of why in the history, for example, of political theory, an understanding in political theory of the state, there is no theory of the media. So if you go back, this is Machiavelli, who says lots about communication, but he says very little about communication and control of communication by the prince or by the state. He says very little about the, if you like, the separation between the fourth estate and the state. And this is simply because the rise of the mass media is very late. So political theory says very little about the media, particularly in its classical forms. But the theory I'm advancing is an idea of constitutionalism. That's the title of my lecture today, and that's the title of the book I'm working on. Why constitutionalism? What do I think? Why do I think this idea helps? Constitutionalism comes out of legal theory. There are lots of people who speak about constitutionalism, but the roots of the idea talk about the value of constitutions and the rule of law, particularly in the view of the modern state as a balance of powers. So constitutionalism, the role of constitutionalism is to limit the use of state power through making explicit, through the rule of law, limits on that state power. And Nicholas Barber and other theorists have developed that idea. So more recently, and those of you who are interested in platform regulation might want to follow up by looking up things like digitalconstitutionalism.org, there is a movement of legal scholars and scholars in the area of platform regulation. Interestingly, a lot of Italian scholars, Oreste Policino, Giovanni Di Gregorio, but others, like those listed on this slide, are involved in trying to look at the emergence of rules on the internet. So it started off with scholars observing that there are many bills of rights on the internet, and trying to understand how on the internet there is a new realm of rulemaking emerging. So digital constitutionalism takes some of these ideas of the value of checks and balances on power, and tries to observe this in terms of emerging rules and codes, like the Brazilian Marco Civil of the internet, and the contract for the web, which is Tim Berners-Lee. Some of these rules come from states and parliaments. Some of these rules come from platforms and civil society. But there is this new realm of emerging rulemaking, which has a slightly ambivalent relationship to state power. So that's the second area where I take this idea of constitutionalism. But in media constitutionalism, what I want to do is look at how those codes and rules, those institutions that check the power of the political economy of the media to shape opinion, to construct propaganda, to shape discourses, how those rules, those checks and balances come about, particularly in relation to the media. And I'm going to speak about this empirically now in relation to 4 stories. I'm going to speak about, I'll come to the topic of the book on the slide there, Victor Pickard's History of American Media. But there are other historians of media systems that have started to use the language of the post-war settlement, that there was a specific historical moment when an institutional framework and a set of legal principles and constitutional principles were set out. And tomorrow I'll be speaking about maybe we're coming to the end of that period, but I think for today I want to speak about how the post-war media constitution emerged. The media constitution being a set of rules, codes, institutions. So I really want to take a big kind of helicopter view of this historical period. Now I need to have a clock in my field of vision. Any questions or comments on the theory so far, or shall I carry on? You with me? Okay. By the way, if you want, I do understand a bit of German. If you want to ask questions in German, we can try. Sorry.
One short question. You mentioned how the large mass media are not only the capitalist placings because of constitutions and of institutions and checks and balances. How do you handle that they might just not be followed?
Good challenge. Good challenge. You know, I don't have a kind of an idea that somehow the media we have is perfect. I think that there are holes in the framework for media responsibility, and there are some very, very bad media. There are some very corrupt media. There are media that do not follow ethical standards, and there are owners that use their media as a tool, you know, as a campaigner and as an activist, one of the things that I've been thinking about and working very hard on is the role, for example, of Rupert Murdoch's media in the United Kingdom, which has not been a beneficial period, and you can see that the breaches of rules and the breaches of ethical constraints have simply been costed into the business model. News Corporation for phone hacking has spent more than £1 billion, £1 billion just in legal costs in order to settle claims. So these are costed in. So I agree with you that the rules will be broken and the rules will be flouted and that will be costed into the business model. But I don't think it does follow that the rules don't mean anything at all. So I think I absolutely take your point. Okay.
This kind of media constitutionalism is something which only works in democracy, for example, because in authoritarian states, media are just a tool for propaganda. I'm not sure whether media constitutionalism would work in another kind of political system than democracy.
Short answer, yes. This is about democracies. This is absolutely about democracies. And, you know, in some of the historical material that I'm going to move to now, we'll see some cases which are transitional cases. But this is about how you have media systems which do enough in order that a state and a system of authority can be legitimized through popular consent. So the idea that consent is given voluntarily and on the basis of individual citizen rationality. So it's about democracy. So where did this media constitution come from? So I think it's useful to get back to the beginning. This is a harrowing picture of 1945 Nagasaki. And the story of the Japanese surrender is a very interesting one, which helps us understand, if you like, the origin story of post-war media systems. So Emperor Hirohito, during the period of the war had remained in place. And after the surrender of Germany, there was a long period between spring of that year and the summer in which it wasn't clear that Japan was going to surrender. It only became clear after the horrific bombings. But the problem remained, how was Japan going to surrender, and how was that going to link into a new regime, the US system of regime change? And the answer was that Emperor Hirohito recorded the surrender onto 2 discs, which were to be broadcast the following day. Nobody in Japan had ever heard his voice. And the question was, who was going to broadcast that? Japan had a public broadcaster, a state broadcaster, NHK. So NHK was going to be the transmitter of this surrender. And indeed, this is what happened. So the occupation of Japan between 1945 and 1952 was a period in which the US occupier immediately introduced a very strong regime of censorship. This was then followed by what has been referred to by historians as the exporting of the First Amendment. So introducing a particular idea of freedom of the press and freedom of expression, initially with some very strong taboos. So the word for atom bomb, for example, was censored until 1950. Many other sensitive political words were censored. But what Japan did, what the Allies did successfully, and also, and I'll come to this in a minute, also in Japan, in Germany did successfully, was introduce a media system and a media constitution which was enough to maintain legitimacy and this notion that citizens are involved in a democratic process of deliberation. So it was through boring old legislation, so an act which was introduced in 1950 and which more or less, after amendment, is the same framework that exists today. Through this legislation, for example, Article 1.2, which says that the broadcasters should be managed according to the principle of ensuring freedom of expression in broadcasting by guaranteeing impartiality, truth, and autonomy. And I asked a Japanese lawyer about that, and he said autonomy refers to autonomy of the broadcaster from the state, not human autonomy. But it's very much a constitutional principle of separation between the broadcasters on the one hand and the state on the other. So this is a blueprint for a system. Now, we could go back to your question and say, well, you know, there have been periods in the meantime of authoritarianism in Japan. Has it been fully democratic? Reporters Without Borders, and also the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Information have very often been critical of the Japanese media system. It's not perfect. You also have problems of power of large corporate bodies, cross-ownership between press and broadcasting. It's not a perfect system. However, the point is that it was founded according to this constitutional principle of separation. So, since it was really the US at this time that was exporting these ideas of separation of the state from the media, what was happening in the US at that time? If we go back to this post-war age where our democratic media systems were invented, we find that the Hutchins Commission was really a crucible of thinking about how to manage media systems effectively. So the Hutchins Commission was set up at the University of Chicago in 1944. It was a civil society body. It developed a number of new theories of what press freedom actually should be. And crucially, one of the things it did was it looked at behavior of the media alongside the structure of media markets. And it's one of the things that I think happened in this post-war period, but didn't happen in other periods and places, looking at the overall market structure. So I think this comes from the report of the Hutchins Commission, and it clearly shows that through concentration of ownership, the variety of sources and opinion is limited. So the problem here is identifying these economic processes which are endemic in media, so the concentration of ownership leading to a narrowing of sources of opinion. But there's also the idea that the quality of offer declines. So the performance of the media, this last sentence, under these circumstances, it becomes an imperative question whether the performance of the press can any longer be left to the unregulated initiative of the few who manage it. So this is something that you wouldn't expect to find at the origin of the US post-war media system. Deep criticism of concentration tendencies and deep criticism of what is delivered by an unregulated market. So what comes out of the Hutchins Commission and what flows through the media system in post-war US? One of the aspects of broadcasting regulation which has been most commented on is the fairness doctrine. Anybody here familiar with the fairness doctrine in the US? Okay, so you've heard of it. It does not exist anymore because it was allowed to, how do you put it? It fell into disuse in the 1980s. You could say it was struck down. The fairness doctrine was an obligation on broadcasters to show two sides of the story. Okay? In the UK, we would call it impartiality, but it was delivered effectively through voluntary self-regulation. But that self-regulation was designed through moments like this and in the judgments of the board of the Federal Communications Commission. So the post-war media environment in the US was quite different to the emerging environment in Europe and in other countries around the world. But it's not true to say that it, because of the First Amendment, was purely based on negative rights and the free marketplace of ideas. So just as an aside, those of you who haven't looked at what is being described as the Trump plan for America, Project 2025, you will find that these debates about the nature of the First Amendment and the extent to which things like the fairness doctrine, things like public radio and public broadcasting should be funded, are still very much live issues in the United States. But what else is happening in debates about media freedom post-1945? What I'm trying to do is build up this picture that this was a constitutional moment because of the end of the war, also because of a deep international debate about why democracies fail. It was really during this post-war period that people had a very open debate about concentration tendencies, monopolistic tendencies, problems of quality in the media, and problems of propaganda. And this was also happening in the UK. So the UK had had very concentrated media systems. We had something called the press barons. And this referred to a practice which, unbelievably, is still the case, of large media owners being appointed to the House of Lords. So in recent years, we've seen Lebedev, the owner of the Evening Standard, being ennobled as Lord Lebedev of Siberia. But there was a sense, going back all the way back to the 1920s and 1930s, that a few small, very large media owners in the press were able to control public opinion to such an extent that they then exerted a huge amount of political power, and that their propaganda use of those newspapers was bad for democracy. So the Labour government elected in 1945 was pressured by the Union of Journalists to start a royal commission. And we can see this as the constitutional moment, if you like, in which constitutional checks and balances on media power were brought into being. Now, we could be forgiven for being a little bit nostalgic about this, but in fact, in the case of the 1947 Royal Commission on the Press in the United Kingdom, and also in these subsequent Royal Commissions and other inquiries, all of the issues were discussed, and some structural limits on media ownership, for example, competition rules which apply to mergers, special public interest tests for mergers, were introduced. All of these things do place real checks on media power and limits on the power of media barons. But in almost all cases, there was a timidity about the policy-making process. So, for example, the first Royal Commission reporting in 1949 discussed whether big media companies should be broken up, and did not do anything that would result in divestment, so would result in breaking up of a media company. So the Royal Commission on the Press discussed all of these issues, but in a sense we're still discussing them. We've just had a Leveson inquiry in the United Kingdom, which attempted also to pose questions about whether media concentration, private control of large media companies was creating problems for democratic trust. There were some reforms introduced to the self-regulatory system, but these have since been reversed. So, just moving on, I just mentioned that also at the level of the international agreements on control of broadcasting spectrum, there was a huge amount of immediate post-war reorganization of broadcasting. But moving on to Germany. So some people are surprised to hear that Germany is often globally seen as a, if you like, a model case for media systems. And in part, that's because of the introduction of measures immediately after the war, which were, again, specifically designed to prevent the failure of democratic legitimacy. So if we think back, as we did in relation to Japan, we think back to the immediate post-war period, the division of Germany into different geographical sectors, the influence of the different occupying powers in different sectors, and in particular, the influence of the United Kingdom in broadcasting, in introducing the federated system of public broadcasting management, the introduction of the German Basic Law, and I understand the German Basic Law is celebrating its birthday, 75 years, so we can toast this very successful constitutional framework. All of these elements were carefully designed by the Allies to maintain the legitimacy of a particular approach to democratic communication, to prevent this situation in which you could have one government, one leader, one broadcasting system transmitting propaganda to everybody. So notions of media plurality, of checks and balances, of constitutional limits on media power date back to then. And we can find them not only in the broadcasting law, but in the Constitution. So the German Basic Law, Article 5.1, sets out some fairly standard but quite strong protections for freedom of expression and also limitations on those rights. But in relation to freedom of the press, and I include here the broadcasting law, there are a number of doctrines and concepts in the constitutional law of the Federal Republic, which many of which do not exist in other countries, and many of which have been seen as a, if you like, a gold standard for broadcasting and media regulation. I list some of them here. We don't have time to go into all of them, but I would recommend my colleague Bernd Holznagel's work on this in terms of the, particularly in broadcasting, the foresight of this court in developing ideas such as the balance between internal pluralism, so that is content regulation of any one media outlet, with external pluralism, that is the plurality of sources and opinions in the system as a whole. Now, in the next lecture, and perhaps in the discussion, we can discuss how some of these concepts and ideas must be updated, but they certainly have been seen as standing the test of time thus far. So, in addition to the countries that we've discussed, Japan, the US, the UK and Germany, there is also an international context to all of this, particularly the development of international human rights law. Primarily the European Convention on Human Rights, but also increasingly the UN Human Rights Council. These principles have really developed this theory of what I call, or I'm calling, the constitution of media. There's a huge amount of standard setting, some of which I've been involved with as an expert, as one of the authors of some of these recommendations of the Council of Europe. But they're developing this theory that media freedom and pluralism and freedom of expression really go together in ways that we should be more explicit about. For example, General Comment 34, this is a UN document, sets out these really quite thoughtful principles. So I'll read that second one. There is now a global network for exchanging ideas and opinions that does not necessarily rely on the traditional mass media. States parties should take all necessary steps to foster the independence of these new media and to ensure access of individuals thereto. So, and I'm going to move to wrap up the lecture shortly. I've argued that there is a emerging in the post-war period, particularly in democracies, there is a theory of institutional freedom of the press. This is what I mean when I talk about the constitutionalism that I'm trying to express here. So, freedom of the press is not simply the absence of state control of the media, although that's what the US First Amendment suggests. In international human rights and in European approaches to the media, and I would argue also in Japan, there is an institutional approach to freedom of the press. So not only do states have to refrain from censoring the media, they also have to do certain things to make sure the media can do their job. That means that privileges are provided to media. So in the United Kingdom, for example, there are tax exemptions. Some countries offer subsidies. In media law, there are public interest defenses specifically for journalism. There is court deference to self-regulation and, of course, protection of sources. But in return for all of these privileges, the press have responsibilities to observe ethical codes, to serve a watchdog role, to provide trusted information for the public, and also, in many cases, to ethically self-regulate. So, just to wrap up here, so the core insight is that privileges and obligations are conditional, and the overall settlement requires balancing, and it also requires, I would argue, an overall moment of system design, and that is the moment when you consider structural matters, market structure, levels of concentration, alongside those behavioral questions of ethics and standards. So, one of the things that I should mention as coming out of these case studies, looking at this historically, is that it would appear, particularly in relation to the case that I perhaps know best, the United Kingdom, that there are processes where, when legitimacy of the overall system is threatened by propaganda or by media concentration or by media ethics, there is a kind of a capacity for self-correction. I should say that I hope that's the case. It seems to be true historically. Privileges seem to be given in return for social benefits. I think this comes up as a question whenever the media claim protection, whether that's in relation to the rules on market abuse or data protection. When they have a privilege, they need to demonstrate that they serve a social purpose. But I think also historically, it's interesting to see that the media themselves fight for their independence. They lobby very hard using their own power. But I hope I've convinced you that there is benefit in looking at this holistically and over the slightly longer historical time frame. So beneath all this, there is this notion that ultimately in democracies, the problem is about legitimacy. So if media power is unconstrained, if media are able to operate outside of any of those accountability mechanisms, then that's fatal for legitimacy of democratic states. And I think that that's Habermas's concern in this quote. So tomorrow I will continue by talking about questions of how I see the reconstitution of the media. We're moving away from these fundamental institutions in which you have a relatively settled framework for broadcasting and a relatively settled framework for the press, which is largely self-regulated and subject to the general law. And I want to look at how, in a platform environment with new distribution mechanisms, we need new approaches for thinking about the constitution of the media. Thank you for your attention.